We start out with looking at phylogeny, which we're going to define in a second, and the history of life and how we got from very simple single-celled prokaryotic organisms to everything we know today. So we're going to look at systematics, phylogeny, classification, and order in living things. So the term systematics, this is a field where scientists start to organize organisms into different groups, which is the classification issue. And hey, check this out. It's all based on their evolutionary relationships, how they are related to some kind of linked or common ancestor. And I know from the exam how they diverged away from each other. A lot of you got stuck on the difference between divergent and convergent. Typically, organisms are diverging away from a common ancestor. So how do we do this? And if we think back to all of the different kinds of support for evidence for evolution, we looked at skulls and we looked at homologous structures and vestigial structures, and we looked at embryos, we looked at, and then we talked about using molecular biology, DNA, RNA, proteins, amino acids. Kind of the first things here were how they originally started to classify organisms, and then eventually with being able to use molecular biology and looking specifically at DNA sequences or RNA sequences or the amino acids that make up proteins. Even now, this is a huge field. If you're somebody who likes puzzles, immunology, molecular biology with a focus on immunology is exploding, because we see a lot of diseases that are getting spread from one organism to the next, and that's called crossing the species barrier. And we've seen that with COVID, we've seen that with HIV/AIDS, we've seen that with a lot of different diseases, and the potential for more to happen, oh, it's just bubbling there. So it's a really, really amazing, cool field to think about, especially for those of you who are thinking about becoming pharmacists. It's a great way to kind of link that pharmacy desire with like exploring and discovering things that could on the spot help humanity. So taxonomy is a branch of systematics. Taxons are groupings. This is how we group organisms that have like characteristics. And again, it could start with just physiologically how they look or act internally, like their metabolisms, but then we start to look at the biochemistry, the molecular biology. Taxonomy uses words to classify. We call those taxons groups. So we have domains, and we have kingdoms, phylums, class, order, family, genus, species. We saw a little bit of this when we did that lab that focused on all the different evidence for evolution, and at the end when you started looking at the comparison of all of the primate skulls, you named those organisms and you started to put them in order by like characteristics, and that was a little exercise in taxonomy. We put all organisms in hierarchical groups. We start with the biggest, most inclusive groups. They include the most. We've got 3 of those. We've got 3 domains. Every living thing goes into either the bacteria, the archaea or archaea, however you want to say that, and the eukarya. And then from there, we get more specific and more specific and more specific as we go down. We get more specific till we get to the species level. Get that species specific? That's where that word comes from. Phylogeny, we get there from systematics. We look at the evolutionary history of an organism. What common ancestor did they have? And the next one back, and the next one back, and the next one back. Phylogenetic relationships focus on evolutionary groupings or a shared history, what was the last common ancestor? What was the common ancestor? It is hypothetically believed that all living things came from a unicellular, prokaryotic, no nucleus, very simple in structure, not many organelles, kind of organism. And from there, diverge and evolution happens, right? They end up in different environments, and the process of natural selection favors certain traits. And then we see that the organisms become different based on evolutionary pressures. Phylogenetic trees, how we show how organisms are related, we put them on these little trees, if you've ever seen them before. We've got a couple of examples up here. What this tree means, and this tree here represents the common ancestor, and how from that common ancestor, so common ancestor would be at the base or the trunk of the tree, the very bottom of the tree would be, this would be your common ancestor, our common ancestor. And then these three branches represent the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So a little bit about, we're going to take a look at those taxon. Sometimes we refer to them as clades. Taxon means naming, clade means group. We're going to give names to the groups that organisms share. One of the things about biology is that we never get away from evolution. In any form of biology, we always kind of think about, like, where did we come from? Why did this happen? Where did this trait come from? How did organisms evolve or change over time? And so what we're going to get into is we're going to get into those evolutionary relationships through taxon, the named groups, and the clades. Clade means group itself. So we're going to name the different groups that organisms belong to and share in common. And that gives us, again, an indication of the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So we have what's called the Linnaean system. I always think this is interesting. It was invented by Carl Linnaeus. Carl Linnaeus went by a bunch of different names. Carl von Linné, probably went by, like, I don't know, he probably had like Lynn, different nicknames. We all have, if we think about ourselves in different groups, like let's say that you have a birthday party and a bunch of different friend groups come, family groups, and you might have this group talking about you and naming you a certain name, and then this group's naming you a different name, and this group, and you might have different names, but you're the same person. And Carl Linnaeus went, like when I studied zoology or botany, what I found was that I was in groups and we were talking about the same thing, but we were calling it something different. And he wanted to make a classification or a taxon system that went by specific names. So that's how we get to the species name, that every organism has their own species name, and that's the language of science, is taxonomy. So that if, and I'll get to that in a second. So let me get to the way that this idea kind of evolved in his head, was that, let's say, we work better in general as humans being organized, right? I know I do. When everything in my house is put where it lives, I'm like, I can just grab things and go, as opposed to when I forget things, like today, right? So things are a little less organized. it's like when you walk into, let's say you walk into Target, and you walk in the door, and if you needed to find Band-Aids, and let's say that the way Target worked was that it was really disorganized, and as trucks came and dropped off stuff to sell, if they just put the stuff in empty places anywhere in the store, it would take you like maybe 2 hours to find Band-Aids, because you wouldn't know where they were at, and where they were at today might be different than tomorrow. But stores got really smart about it. So you walk into Target and you might have food on this side, clothes in the middle, bath and home stuff in the back, and then you've got your like toys and things like that, and you've got pharmacy stuff over here. So if you walked in and you were like, oh, let me look, and oftentimes there's signs hanging from the ceiling that you could just look up and go, oh, I need to go toward health and beauty over that way, or the pharmacy, so you can go that way. And at the end of every row, it will say things like vitamins, first aid, and you can go, oh, I need to go to the first aid aisle, and then you go down that aisle, and even within that aisle, there's little signs that are sticking out. And so you can get to what you need very quickly, because it is organized and it is labeled, and that's the way science works. That is the system that Carl Linnaeus came with. Okay, so we're gonna go from our naming systems of most inclusive. When I say that, think about the word inclusive means includes. So we have 3 large groups that include every organism. Every organism is either in the bacteria, the archaea, or the eukarya. So those we call the domain. Then from each domain, you start to have more organizational levels that get more specific based on the traits that organisms have. So now we're going to start to get least inclusive until we get to species or specific. So we go from most inclusive, including the most organisms, to least inclusive, the species, which only includes 1 group each. So we go domain, kingdoms, phylums, class, order, family, genus, and then species. The genus and species refer to a name of an organism, but you could have different organisms in the same genus but be a different species, like Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis. We share the same genus as the Neanderthals, but we are different species within. We are separated, or we are inclusive of just being our own organism. Okay, so this is one of my favorite animals in the world, my favorite organisms. This is Chelinius undulatus. This fish lives in the Indo-Pacific. It gets to be about this big. You can see the cool, it has really cool color patterns on it. It's got a big eye, it's got a weird hump. It's got a really big mouth, and it's got some weird teeth that kind of hang down, so it looks kind of like that. In one reef area, there's only one of this type of Chelinius undulatus. This is what we call a supermale. The rest of the species are females and males who are more blandly colored. So here we have one male who's like big and bright and beautiful and weird and cool looking, and the rest of the males are smaller and not so colorful. The females want to mate with the supermale. So the females, so here's a case where usually males will put on a little like show to try and attract the females. Here's a case where the females are going to be like, hey, look at me, mate with me. So they're trying to get this guy's genes. But here's where things go really wacky with this supermale. When the supermale dies, it is believed that it gives off pheromones or some kind of chemicals to let the community know, I'm dying. One female, based on her genetics, there's got to be some connection to the supermale genes. One female in the community begins to switch up her internal physiology to become male. She starts to grow in size, change in color, and she becomes the supermale now. Cool, right? So this species is called Chelinius undulatus. I was scuba diving in the Philippines, and somebody on the boat said, "Oh my gosh, did you see that humphead wrasse?" And somebody else said, "I saw this Napoleon wrasse, it was wild." And somebody else said, "Oh, the Ipus, it was so cool." And then I was like, "Oh, I saw the double-headed Maori wrasse. I loved it, it's my favorite." Guess what? We were all talking about the same thing. And eventually in that conversation, we start talking about, well, what color was yours? And what did it look like? What kind of behaviors did it do? And we're like, wait a minute. And then we go to our little identification book. We're like, we're all talking about Chelinius undulatus. So because there are so many different, what we call common names, it's really important to have what we say is the binomial system of nomenclature. Binomial means bi means two, nomial name, nomenclature is a system of naming. So that when we talk about the two name system, we're talking about the genus and the species. What Carlos Linnaeus said, hey, we should have this taxon, the naming system, be really organized. We should put them into clades or groups. So that when scientists are communicating about something, they're not wasting time trying to figure out like, oh crap, we have been talking about the same thing this whole time. So we could just say a scientific name. The scientific name, so here's another one. He went by also Carl von Linné, like Carolus Linnaeus, Carl von Linné. He had a lot of names too. Two names, the genus and the species. 1, 2, genus and species name. So let's talk a little bit about this. This is really important to understand as you'll go into many other classes. You will be talking about specific species, and you want to make sure that you are communicating this binomial system of nomenclature correctly. Your professors are going to be really picky about you not communicating this perfectly and correctly, and they'll probably take up points, and or they'll look at you like, how do you not know this? So you have to make sure that when you're looking at the genus name in our example of Chelinius undulatus, a couple things that I want you to know. I have this typed in italics. I also have the genus name is capitalized, the species name is not. So we've got a couple of rules here, just like these other scientific names here. You could kind of notice that genus names are always capitalized and the species names are not. They're all typed in italics so that what we know about the green sea turtle, Chelonia mitis, the Callicebus malik, the red titi monkey, the northern cardinal, Cardinalis cardinalis, you're seeing a lot more of those coming through right now, and Escherichia coli, or E. coli. The genus name, again, always capitalized. Always, always, always. This is where you gotta get out of text mode, where you just like don't capitalize words anymore, which makes me a little insane. I still like properly text everything. My son's like, oh, mine always look so perfect. I'm like, I just what I'm used to. Species name is not capitalized. You've got to make sure you capitalize the genus name, do not capitalize the species name. If you're typing, they go in italics, always. If you're writing, like let's say that you're in a lab and you're looking at different kinds of bacteria under a microscope, you're going to underline your genus and species name. You're on a boat somewhere and you're studying fish species in Belize on a coral reef, you're going to underline those names. So wherever you're at, walking through the forest, and you're taking data for another class, you're going to underline those names. So this brings us to biodiversity and thinking about all the organisms out there. Now biodiversity, one of the things about it is that we've got two words in this name, right? There's BIO. What does BIO mean? Right, good, life, living thing. And diversity. Biodiversity means the diversity of living things. But here's where a lot of times people get this wrong, is that biodiversity is not just the diversity of all the living things. but it also accounts for the relationships between all of those living things. And that's something that's kind of like embedded in this term biodiversity, because we know that we can't survive without other species. Other species can't survive without other species. And for example, just any photosynthetic organisms, everybody relies on those to get their energy sources from. So the term biodiversity shouldn't just conjure up that there's a lot of species out there, but that there's a complexity of the relationships between those species as well. All right, so let's talk raw numbers. Estimated biodiversity. So this is where it's like, well, okay, about every year, you could go out and you could name a new species. Oh, so a student, I can't remember, they were telling me that they took a class where they went like camping for a week somewhere like north, and the professor they were with was like, you could discover a new species, which they often did in this area. They were looking at insects specifically. And so like the excitement of like, ooh, I could like discover something new, right? So even you could be part of a class that discovers something new. Every year about 10,000 new species are discovered. Just from the tropical rainforest. Think about all the other places on the earth that new species could be living. There's about 1.5 million species identified. Do you think there's a lot more species than that? Oh, heck yeah, there are. Some people think there's about 7 to 10 million, and then people think like there's gotta be at least 100,000 million. Which is like what, a billion, a gazillion, I don't know, one of those big numbers, right? So there's a lot more out there to be discovered. So you could name a new species. But then let's think about the kind of juxtaposition between that and what is actually identified. So here's where things get a little bit weird, and we'll think about human nature when we're looking at identified biodiversity. Okay, I want you all to think about your phones or your computers or your tablets. When you stick a picture on the screen, think about what organism you have a picture of. It could be another human, could be your dog, your cat, your reptile, could be a pretty flower. How many of you have bacteria on your phone screen? Your tablet? Yeah? You have bacteria on there? I mean, like, as a picture. Oh, no, not just like accidental. It was like, oh yeah, there's tons of them. No, as a picture, like you chose a picture of a bacteria to put on the screen, your wallpaper. Anybody? A protist? Anybody got an amoeba? No. So what we usually have is we usually have things that look like us, right? They have eyes and a nose and a face, and they're cute. That's what we usually have. So human nature, we're attracted to things that look like us, that are cute like us, right? So there's only, of all of the biodiversity that's named, only about 5% are prokaryotes and protists. What do you think has the most organisms? These little microorganisms. So while there's the most of those, only about 5% are discovered because, and it depends on you, if you're the kind of person, like you think about classes I'm looking forward to taking, and you're like, I can't wait to take micro, because I'm gonna look under the microscope all the time, I'm gonna plate out bacteria, I'm gonna put them in the incubator, I'm gonna wait a couple days to see what I got, then I'm gonna analyze them, I'm gonna make slides, I'm gonna stain them, I'm gonna be in the microscope. Anybody excited about that? Yeah. So most of us are not like super into the whole process of identifying prokaryotes or protists or microorganisms. It is for some people, but for most people you're like, oh, that's like so much waiting, right? You gotta plate them out and then see what you get. So that's a lot of waiting. So human nature doesn't like lend us to making those kind of discoveries, but there's a ton to be discovered. There are the most groups to be discovered. So like when I talked about immunology before, a part of that would be working in that environment or working in a lab where you're sequencing DNA or RNA. So a lot of times we're just kind of like, well, maybe you want to be outside, or maybe you want to work directly with an organism, like a human or animals, for example, or plants. Plants and fungi getting up there, about 22%. Do you suppose that there are a lot more plants than animals in the world? Yeah, remember the trophic pyramid, right? Primary producers are way more than the consumers. Fungi, oh, there's so much cool fungi research going on right now. Trying to figure out, I just read an article, how mushroom species are changing. People who consume certain species of mushrooms, changing the way their brains operate. And it's making their brains operate more efficiently and effectively. There's also research about the magic mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, that in very small quantities may be the secret to curing anxiety, depression, other mental health disorders. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on here, and always with plants, right? Plants are wild. The rest are animals. There's a lot less of those consumers in that trophic pyramid, but again, we're just like attracted to the cute, it's so cute. We go with the most easily identifiable species that we want to study. But we need more of working with the microscope and the plating and the DNA and the RNA and the sequencing. We need a lot more of that. So those of you, again, you're thinking about, I'm not really sure, but you know, like I love a good puzzle. I love puzzles. I do puzzles every day. You like puzzles? There's a lot in biomedical or bioengineering that you can do. UIC has a fantastic master's program in biomedical engineering. All right, so here's back to our phylogenetic tree. Our tree shows us the base of the tree indicates there's a common ancestor here. This is the thing that everybody evolved from. You guys have this somewhere in your notes. Yeah, next page. Top of the next page. Like if you go a couple of 2 pages further, just to talk about it. So, common ancestor. From the common ancestor, natural selection occurs. We get 2 groups. Notice the Eukarya does not come off of the common ancestor. They evolve later. So from our prokaryotic, no nucleus, single-celled common ancestor with not so many organelles, you get the whole domain of bacteria and you get the archaea. The Eukarya, we have evidence that they evolved from a common ancestor with the archaea. One of the things that I want to point out is that every time you have a splitting of the branches, what you have is you have a common ancestor. Remember Archaeopteryx? Archaeopteryx was that like bird reptile thing, and it had wings, but it had claws on its wings, and it had like bird-like legs, and it had a long tail like a snake, and it had a beak, but it had little teeth on the beak, so it had a lot of reptile characteristics and a lot of bird characteristics. So Archaeopteryx would be, you know, like in one of these little branches. It's a common ancestor to the 2 groups. It doesn't mean that necessarily birds came from reptiles or reptiles from birds. It means they had a common ancestor with one another. So everywhere that I put a little star, that means those groups had a common ancestor. They have a relationship, but one didn't come from the other. So like when people say, I don't believe humans evolved from monkeys, I'm always like, we didn't. We had a common ancestor with the primates, actually. And then they go, we're not a gorilla. I don't know, I don't have that much hair on my body, but I think, and I walk upright, I'm not a gorilla, no, I'm not a monkey, but we had a common ancestor between us. So just to note that. This is it's the common ancestor, that one right there. Meaning that it's the number one common ancestor to all living things. And again, if you remember, I talked about with evolution, we don't know how this common ancestor came about. Science debates that. Science has evidence to support maybe. They have hypotheses, like Miller-Urey showed that whole system of how this could be, might, maybe, gives us evidence to show what could have happened, but we don't know. So just a little info about our phylogenetic tree. All right, let's go back a little bit in your notes. So these trees are showing evolutionary relationships. And again, oh look, I've got little arrows here too. Common ancestor, common ancestor. Wherever you have a branch, there's a common ancestor. So if I had a true or false question and said, animals share a common ancestor with protists, would that be true or false? With protists. No, we have a common ancestor with fungi. You're a fungus. You're not a fungus. You have a common ancestor. Animals have a common ancestor with the fungi. Eukarya have a common ancestor with bacteria. True or false? Eukarya have a common ancestor with bacteria. Archaea have a common ancestor with Archaea have a common ancestor with Eukarya. True. Okay. So you just have to look and see. Now, the other thing that I want to point out, and again, this gets into like, we like things with cute faces like us. Look at all of the different branches here on the bacteria and the archaea that are not labeled. There's a ton of work that needs to be done here. But Eukarya, we have the whole like domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We have a lot of this is named. We have the taxon or the clades named here. We just haven't named these. And these are like where they think some branches occur, but there's no kingdoms yet even in the archaea and the bacteria. People are working on that. They're starting to separate them. But here's the other wild thing, is that while these organisms are very, very simple, they can do very, very complex things, like murder us, right? So there's a lot that needs to be figured out. Archaeas are really weird, extreme. We often call them extremophiles. There could be a lot of answers for renewable energy in here. Bacteria, most of them we need. They live all over Kayla's computer. I think ours too, right? We need them. They're good. They're symbiotic. Like 1% and 1% and 1% and 1% of bacteria are actually pathogenic or disease causing. So all of this stuff, do you think it's necessarily good for us? No. There's been studies in a while ago, Japanese culture, that got really big before like all of these like pandemics were happening. They used a lot of sanitizers. They cleaned their houses. It was like pristinely clean, no playing in the dirt. It got to be like your white clothes got to be perfectly white all the time. And because of that like focus on cleanliness and hygiene, they had a lot more diseases than other cultures did. Kills the good stuff. So that balance of like, you know, like in the summertime, maybe, you know, you're just out and about. You don't want to necessarily wash all the good stuff off all the time. If you're in a public place, you certainly have more access to stuff, so that's where you want to really wash your hands really well or use the sanitizer. So it's kind of like that. We have to find a balance between what's going to kill us and what we need. There's a lot in here that we could figure out. There's whole huge, if you've heard the term microbiome, huge fields studying microbiomes, all of the microorganisms that live in and on us and how they keep us healthy, but how they also contribute to diseases. And they're finding links between the genetic factors of, like in my family, high cholesterol, or the chances of having a heart attack in my future genetically are there. The bacteria that I have in my microbiome may accelerate that. Then there's other factors too, right? Like I can control it more, like exercise every day and don't eat meat. And so there's a big difference between like my dad's cholesterol and my cholesterol, because I maybe eat meat a couple times a year. So my cholesterol is very good, it's low, and his was really high because he ate meat every day, ate a lot of sugar, drink water and coffee and Coca-Cola. You know, so you can accelerate all of these diseases based on 3 factors: is your genetics, your own environment that you create and foster, and then your microbiome, which is a little bit of that fostering, and it's a lot of like how you're surrounded or who you're surrounded with in the world. So a lot of stuff. Hopefully give you some ideas of where you might want to go in life. Okay, so 3 domains. There's the archaea or archaea, however you want to say it. Prokaryotic. Pro means before. Karyotic means nucleus. These cells evolved before a nucleus evolved. They have no nucleus. Before the nucleus. Evolved before pro-nucleus, karyotic. Bacteria, excuse me, that domain is also prokaryotic. They also evolved before the nucleus evolved. Both of these groups, single-celled, simple, been around for a really long time. Even though humans are a lot more complex, who do you think, in terms of domains, has a bigger chance of going extinct? Animals, or the kingdom Animalia have a greater chance of going extinct, or these 2 domains? The animals, right? So just because organisms are complex doesn't necessarily mean better in terms of evolution. Eukarya. Eu means true. Karyotic nucleus. They have a true nucleus. They have the nucleus. So these are the most inclusive. All organisms are categorized into one of these 3 taxon. And then, as I mentioned, the Eukarya do have kingdoms. It used to be one kingdom of Protists, and then people started using like the biomedical stuff, and they started going like, hey, wait a minute. These are a lot more complex than one kingdom, and I think there's 7 kingdoms, and then 2 they're trying to figure out, but that could change any day now too. So there's kingdoms of Protista. I'm not going to mention all of them. Kingdom fungi, kingdom plantae, and the kingdom Animalia. So this gives you a little idea of how there's a common ancestor, right? Common ancestor here, and then all of these groups share common ancestors. These are all of the Eukarya. So this would be the first Eukaryan common ancestor here. And then you've got such a diversity of different, these are all the named kingdoms that we have right now, but that's still, one of the things about taxonomy is that with advances in technology, things change. All right, so a little bit about the Eukaryas. All cells have a nucleus. Well, our red blood cells are a eukaryotic cell with no nucleus. So there's always an exception in biology. We'll talk about that when we get to the circulatory system too. All right, and then we've got all these groups, right? We've got all these groups in there. So here's the deal. They used to include the protists as one group. And then they started going like, wait a minute, there's a lot of diversity here. And then look how small these groups are in even comparison to something that is considered more microorganism. And we even have some macroorganisms here with the seaweed. Okay, we'll get into details of all of those different things, all of these things, as we go throughout the unit. We'll save the animals for last. So what I would like to do is I would like to go to the lab but start talking about plants, because we're going to do a lab that goes along with the first part of the plant stuff, and all the plant specimens are in there, and I can talk about them as we go through this first part of the lecture. So